Combustion is a mage spell. 3 mana, deal 4 damage to a minion. Any excess damages both neighbors. So the obvious comparison for this card is Shadow Bolt, a card that has seen very limited play throughout the history of Hearthstone. But a lot of the problem with Shadow Bolt is that 4 damage tends to be too much at this mana cost. Like a lot of times it's 3 mana deal 3 or even 3 mana deal 2. And you don't have that problem nearly as often with Combustion. I think one of the major applications of this card is going to be dealing with Satyr Overseer. So if you just Shadow Bolt the Satyr Overseer, it's 3 mana deal 2 damage, but if you Combustion it, you kill the Overseer and the Satyr that it summons, and maybe even like a Battle Fiend that they had in play already. So just in that specific scenario alone, Combustion is quite a bit more powerful than Shadow Bolt, I would say. Another good use of the card would be against Rogue. So a lot of times they stick a Spy Mistress on turn 1 and just leave it stealthed until it can take a good trade. But if you have Combustion and they play like a Lackey or a Pharaoh Cat or, I don't know, a Greyheart Sage or something, then you can Combustion their new minion plus the Spy Mistress that they wanted to have in play for a while. So I think this card is actually pretty flexible, and like even in the worst case scenario where you're just killing one minion, it's still fine, but then it's just Shadow Bolt with like so much potential upside in the right scenarios. So I actually think this card is pretty good. I think it could even potentially just slot into Highlander Mage. I don't know necessarily what slot it takes up, and you know, it's not one of the best things in the world with Tortollan Pilgrim, but it is pretty good at fending off aggression. Demon Hunter, maybe Regular Hunter, maybe Pirate Warrior or something. So I think Combustion is a very reasonable card. Next up we have Headmaster Kel'Thuzad, neutral legendary. 5 mana 4/6, spell burst. If the spell destroys any minions, summon them. So there's obviously a lot of potential upside with this card. I think in the reveal video they showed Brawl. That's kind of sketchy, because I'm pretty sure Kel'Thuzad needs to live the Brawl for his spell burst to go off, so I don't know if I'm necessarily in love with that, but if it works, it's a huge board swing. Maybe something along those lines that would be a little bit more practical would be in Priest with Shadow Word Rune. He has the perfect stat line to dodge the destruction on the Shadow Word Rune, and it has the potential to give you a ton of value, so that could be very powerful. And Priest, of course, also has single target removal. They have like Shadow Word Death, they have Time Warp, and then even smaller stuff like Penance. All of that is pretty reasonable with the Headmaster Kel'Thuzad as well. And I think that stuff is probably more reasonable than something like Shadow Word Rune. It's pretty hard to be in a position where there's like a ton of big stuff your opponent has and you can kill all of it and res it with Kel'Thuzad. But I don't think it needs to be that flashy. Just 7 mana, 4/6, and mind control their thing basically is pretty strong, I would say. Shaman has another really good activator for it with Torrent. 1 mana deal 8 damage, so 6 mana, make a 4/6, and mind control their thing, assuming it has 8 or less health, which everything will on turn 6. So that's a pretty powerful synergy as well. Shaman also has access to Lightning Storm, which is a reasonably good activator for the Kel'Thuzad, but unfortunately they're bigger AoE spells. The Hagathis Scheme and the Earthquake don't really work quite as well with the Headmaster. But basically what I'm getting at is, if you can destroy either one pretty high value thing, or a bunch of small things, or a bunch of high value things obviously, this is definitely a powerful effect. And there are, of course, multiple classes that can make use of this. The thing I'm concerned about though is that it's definitely pretty slow, and on top of being slow, it's also situational. So this would have to go into like some sort of Control Priest archetype, and I can't even really think of anything other than Control Priest that would want to play this. But even in Control Priest, it's a little bit difficult to find room for this. I guess maybe it takes up like the Murazond slot or something, and that could be pretty reasonable. But at the end of the day, it's definitely a slow, clunky value card. And it's definitely... Slow, clunky value cards definitely don't have a home in every meta. So we'll have to see how things go for the Headmaster. Next up we have Steeldancer, a rogue warrior dual class card. 4 mana 4/4 battlecry, summon a random minion with cost equal to your weapon's attack. At first I thought this card was pretty bad, but the more I think about it, the more reasonable it feels. I do feel like you kind of need to be at the 3 power threshold on your weapon for this to be good. Because if you're just getting a 2-drop, it's like probably above average. The above average 2-drop is probably like a River Croc. And 4 mana 4/4 that summons a River Croc is not especially powerful by today's standards. But I think once you start getting up to a 3 attack weapon, it seems pretty reasonable. Getting up to a 3 attack weapon seems probably more likely in Rogue than it does in Warrior. It curves pretty nicely in Rogue after either Deadly Poison or Hooked Scimitar. If you're getting a 4/4 that summons a 4-drop, that seems quite strong, I would say. And of course you also have Waggle Pick. But the thing is, if you're playing a Rogue deck that's playing Waggle Picks and Hooked Scimitars, I feel like that deck is probably pretty aggressive. And if you're just trying to hit the opponent in the face with weapons, I'm not completely convinced that you want your 4-drop to just be a pile of stats, when it could be, you know, something that controls the board more immediately with like Rush, or it could just be a damage card, or instead of a 4-drop, you might just want to be playing 2-drops or something. But I do think on a 4-power weapon, it's probably just good enough stats that you're like fine with that, in the same way that like old Aggro Shaman played 4 mana 7/7. This is just kind of a lot of stats. So I think in that kind of rogue deck, it is pretty reasonable. I don't necessarily know that like Galakron Rogue is going to try to jam in Deadly Poison or anything. I think that's just a bit too situational. So it would probably need to be a new rogue deck, or maybe like Quest Rogue, since their hero power gives you a good weapon for it so consistently. I think this is a bit sketchier in Warrior. It does curve nicely with Corsair Cache into 3 mana weapon into Steeldancer. But typically your 3 mana weapons in a Corsair Cache deck are going to be Ankar and Livewire Lance. Then you're getting a 2-drop off the Steeldancer. Just doesn't seem too exciting to me. Especially since you're like drawing stuff with your Ankar and Livewire Lance, and then you're spending your turn 4 not able to play the things you drew. So I'm not super enthused by that. But perhaps if the warrior you're playing is a pirate warrior, it curves pretty nicely off of Imprisoned Gnarg, and as a pirate warrior, you can also pretty reasonably play Upgrade. This deck also plays Arcanite Reaper, but sort of the same problem as with the rogue, except maybe even more so. In pirate warrior, like, do you want to pile of stats on turn 4? Or do you want to be playing Korkron and hitting him in the face, or Mortal Strike and hitting them in the face? It's definitely a pretty slow card for the kinds of decks that would want to play it. But again, maybe it's just enough stats that that's kind of fine. I don't think this is going to see a home in like Enrage Warrior, because like I said, the weapons aren't good enough, and I think that deck is too synergy dependent. And I don't think a control deck would ever want this. So it's definitely going to be like some sort of aggressive rogue or aggressive warrior, and it sort of just remains to be seen if those decks exist, and if they exist, if they want a stat pile on turn 4. Next up we have Infiltrator Lilian, a rogue legendary. 4 mana, 4/2 stealth, death rattle, summon a 4/2 Forsaken Lilian that attacks a random enemy. So the first thing I thought of when I saw this card is Wasteland Assassin, which is a 5 mana 4/2 stealth, which gives you another 4 power minion. Very comparable stat lines. But Lilian seems quite a bit better than Wasteland Assassin. She's got, she costs 1 less mana, and on the back end she has 1 extra stat, plus she's faster because the Death Rattle attacks immediately instead of the Reborn, which has to sit around for a turn. So that's like 3 upsides on the Wasteland Assassin, which honestly is like a pretty reasonable card. I don't think it's like a terrible idea to play Wasteland Assassin in maybe like Highlander Hunter or something like that. And with Infiltrator Lilian being so much better, I definitely think it's a card that could see play. If that aggro weapon rogue is a thing, I think you definitely play Infiltrator Lilian. You might even just jam her into a Galakron rogue. It's a little bit hard to find a slot for her, but she's pretty strong. And she also happens to have stealth synergy for the Greyheart Sage. And because of that, perhaps stealth is the preferred rogue archetype over secret going forward. But yeah, I think the effect on this is pretty strong. You can stealth it and then like trade it off, and it immediately takes another attack to trade off or still get some face damage in. Or it's like pretty resilient to Consecration. I just think the effect on this card is pretty strong. It's a lot of stats for 4 mana, and it's pretty much guaranteed to be 4 face damage if you want it. And sometimes it's even quite likely to be 8 face damage. So yeah, I think this card is just powerful. Your opponent, of course, can control it a bit. They can, you know, have some lackeys in play or whatever, and then consecrate it, and then your 4-power thing runs into a lackey. But, like, that's a problem that Imprisoned Felmaw already has. And Imprisoned Felmaw is, like, I'm pretty sure this is, like, a top 5 card in Highlander Hunter. So, I think, everything considered with Infiltrator Lilian, I think the card is quite good, and probably sees play in most rogue decks. Next we have Cycle of Hatred, 7 mana Demon Hunter spell. Deal 3 damage to all minions, summon a 3/3 spirit for every minion killed. This is certainly a high value card, but my problem is dealing 3 damage to all minions on turn 7. I mean, it's been a long time since I was excited to play Flame Strike on turn 7. 4 damage is just so often not good enough, and against the decks where it is good enough, it's pretty slow. And Cycle of Hatred is just as slow, but even less of a board clear. It does obviously have the upside. If you kill a bunch of things and get a bunch of 3/3s, it's pretty insane. But I think for the most part, if I'm playing a Demon Hunter that wants this effect, I'd rather just play Chaos Nova. 2 less mana for 1 more damage on the AoE. And that's if my Demon Hunter even wants to be playing an AoE card. The current, and really like for the last 4 months, the build of Demon Hunter has been pretty aggressive, maybe tipping into mid-range, but pretty aggressive. And I don't really see much of a reason to think that Demon Hunter will deviate from that going forward, mostly just because the hero power is so aggressive. I don't see much of a reason to change. So on top of Cycle of Hatred already being kind of a sketchy board clear because it's so slow, it also seems somewhat unlikely to me that there's even going to be a control Demon Hunter or this slow of a mid-range Demon Hunter. But it's certainly a powerful effect if it goes off. Next we have Brittlebone Destroyer, the first of several Priest/Warlock cards. 4 mana 3/3 Battlecry. If your hero's health changed this turn, destroy a minion. So health changed this turn, it can either be a heal or a self-damage. Obviously, that's why it's a Priest/Warlock card. So the obvious comparison to this is the rogue card Vilespine Slayer, a card that has seen quite a bit of play in rogue decks over the years. But I think Vilespine Slayer rather, is quite a bit better than this card. Because, well, the most obvious is that it has an extra stat point, that's always nice. It does cost 1 more mana, but when you look at the Brittlebone Destroyer, it pretty much, like, I think the most common usage of it is going to be using your hero power along with it. So it's kind of like a 6 mana card, where Vilespine's a 5 mana card. Vilespine, of course, just has natural synergy with, like, coin as well, which is one of the reasons it was so strong. But on top of that, I think Rogue is just way more interested in this effect than either Priest or Warlock are. A minion that destroys another minion is a lot stronger in a tempo deck than it is in some sort of control deck. And Rogue is, pretty much always a tempo deck, whereas Priest usually isn't, and Warlock only is about half the time. So generally, I just think Rogue is way more interested in this effect than either Priest or Warlock are. So for a lot of reasons, I don't think it's necessarily appropriate to just say, oh, Vile Spine Slayer was good, so this is good too. But with that being said, I'm not saying this is a terrible card. If we look at popular Priest decks, they of course have their hero power to activate it. They have Renew, Penance, Apotheosis, maybe Kronks. Can always burgle into stuff, and they can always, change their deck slightly to include like another activator or whatever. So Priest does have a lot of activators for this. I think my problem with this card in Priest, though, is like, do you really even want to play this over, say, Shadow Word Death? Shadow Word Death is, less situational because it works on its own, and it's half as much mana in a deck that doesn't really care about the tempo that much. So I'm not really sure that any sort of control Priest is really going to be that interested in this card. If there's more of a tempo Priest, I could certainly see them being more interested in a Vile Spine Slayer type card, but I think if you're playing some sort of tempo-oriented Priest, it's probably just not that easy to activate this. Like maybe one of your 1-drops is Reliquary of Souls, that's a way to change your health on your turn. But other than that, and I guess Apotheosis as well, but other than those couple lifesteal effects, it's not that easy to activate the effect on this card. So I'm not sure that more aggressive priests can use this, and I'm not sure that slower priests are that interested in this card. I think it's a little bit more reasonable in Warlock, though. Warlock has Life Tap, Rain of Fire, Nether Breath, Praise Netherwing, and Aranasi Broodmother. And of course, with the Broodmothers, you also sometimes are playing Plot Twist. So quite a few activators. But the thing is, like looking at this Quest Warlock list, for example, I'm just not really sure where you make room to play Brittlebone Destroyer. Seems like most of the cards we're playing in this list are, in the list for a reason. But maybe it's better than like a Twisting Nether or something like that, depending on the meta. I do sort of feel like, though, if this kind of Warlock deck wanted Brittlebone Destroyer, it would probably be playing Siphon Soul already. I mean, it's basically, well, it's a very similar card. They both kind of cost 6 mana because most of the time you're going to be life tapping with Brittlebone Destroyer. So 6 mana destroy a thing, and I don't think this deck is very interested in playing Siphon Soul right now. But I do think this card is better than Siphon Soul. It just seems like Siphon Soul's close enough that if they wanted this effect, it would be fine to play. They do play Caladan, of course, but that card has a pretty massive upside in this deck. But it's also kind of meta-dependent. Perhaps this deck doesn't play Siphon Soul right now because there's just not great targets for it. Like, Siphon Soul's a pretty trash card against Demon Hunter. I don't think you would play Brittlebone Destroyer against Demon Hunter either. But if we go, like, super mid-range or, like, a lot of ramp druids or something like that, then cards like this start looking more appealing. And I do think this sort of Quest Warlock deck has enough activators that it would be pretty reasonable to play. It's also possible that there's a slow Warlock deck that just isn't Quest, so you aren't taking up deck slots with, Quest, Plot Twist, Malagos, and would be more interested in an effect like this. A problem I haven't really touched on, though, is that, like, in this Quest Warlock deck, and also in the Galakron Priest deck, in the late game, you're throwing away your hero power that enables this, so that does make it a little bit sketchier. But I think the decks probably have enough activators either way. Probably the most interesting thing about this card, or the most interesting application, possibly could be in some sort of Zoo deck. Current Zoo decks don't really enable this very well. I think this list I've copied doesn't even play Flame Imp. But it is pretty easy to put Flame Imp in your Zoo deck, obviously. On top of Flame Imp, you can play Neferset Thrasher. That's a very good activator that curves right into this card. Doesn't even cost any extra mana to activate it. There's that 1-drop Soulbound Ash Tongue. from Ashes of Outland. That's a reasonable activator for this card. And then, of course, you still have Life Tap, depending on what you're playing. I don't know, maybe you throw in a Voodoo Doctor as another activator or something. But this is a tempo deck. This is a deck that would want to play Vile Spine Slayer, so could potentially be pretty interested in a Brittlebone Destroyer. So I've kind of rambled on about this card quite a bit, but basically what I'm getting at is it's definitely better in tempo decks than it is in control decks, but it's probably like pretty reasonable in control decks as well. Powerful card. Next up we have Boneweb Egg. 2 mana 0/2 Death Rattle, summon 2 2/1 spiders. If you discard this, trigger its Death Rattle. So I definitely think this card is strong. You want to compare it to Scarab Egg, which is a card that has seen play in Warlock in the past. I'm not sure if 3 1/1s is better or worse than 2 2/1s, but I think they're close enough in power level that it's pretty reasonable. Of course, one of the reasons Scarab Egg saw play is that Grim Rally was a card, which I actually thought until today that Grim Rally was still in Standard, but apparently it's not. So without Grim Rally, this sort of egg effect definitely looks a bit less appealing. As far as activators for it, like maybe you're playing Plague of Flames in this deck. It's actually kind of good with Plague of Flames on either half of the card. You can also play like, you know, Void Terror. That's a way to eat an egg. But for the most part, I think the only real activator for this is Evil Genius. And like, maybe Terran Gorefiend. I guess to a lesser extent, Imprisoned Scrap Imp as an activator. But I'm really just looking at Evil Genius. And I think as efficiently statted as this card is, that's not enough activators to interest me in playing this. Especially since Zoo has like so many other things they can be doing. They can be doing the self-damage thing. They've got Magic Carpet, so they want 1-drops. So I don't think I'm that interested in playing the Boneweb Egg. It of course also has the if you discard this trigger, which is kind of weird because even though Warlock does currently play some discard stuff, they play Expired Merchant and Nightshade Matron, both of which discard the highest cost card in your hand. And at 2 mana, this is not going to be the highest cost card in your hand very often. So, are you discarding this with Soulfire? I mean, it seems like an odd time to release this card, because it seems like there are so few activators for the part about it that makes it really unique. Weird card, I would say. But like, yeah, it's definitely a high power level card. I just think with the current card pool, it's not really supported that well. Next we have Disciplinarian Gandling, another priest/warlock card, this time a legendary. 4 mana 3/6, after you play a minion, destroy it, and summon a 4/4 Failed Student. So this card is insane. 4 mana 3/6 is already pretty reasonable as a stat line, and then there's just the ridiculous upside this card offers. Warlock is already forcing a bunch of shitty 1-drops just because they play Scrap Imp and Magic Carpet. And I think turning, you know, Beaming Sidekick into a 4/4 is pretty nuts. Turn Fiendish Servant or Guardian Og Merchant into a 4/4, absolutely insane. It is like pretty slow if you're trying to hold it for like turn 6 double 1-drop. But you can just play this thing on turn 4 or coin it out on turn 3. And it's got 6 health. How often does it really die? I mean, there were a ton of times that you just played, say, Houndmaster Shaw on turn 4. This is the exact same stat line, and Houndmaster Shaw survived a lot. So, yeah, I mean, this card is just, like, pretty obviously good to me. I think Zoo absolutely plays it. I don't think it's enough to put the egg in the deck, but, you know, maybe it is. Egg is one of the better things to play into Gandling. But I don't think it really matters that much what you're playing into Gandling. Like, it doesn't need a Death Rattle. Just play a Lackey, and that's insane value. So yeah, this card's insane in Zoo. Probably, you know, not as good in Quest Warlock, where most of the stuff that you're playing is shrinking, but there's certainly a hypothetical application for it in Warlock outside of Zoo, probably. Now, this is a half-Priest card, but it's a little sketchier in Priest, I would say. This build of Priest only plays, like, Disciple of Galakron that you'd be interested in playing with us. But this might be a good enough card to just shift Priest builds. Like, you can scrap Thought Seals and start playing Psychic Conjurers instead. Maybe there's some build that plays Cleric of Scales. Priest, for some reason, has a lot of shitty 1-drops that you'd be, like, pretty interested in playing with this guy. Maybe even Evil Conscriptor, because it's 2 4/4s that you can get off your Gandling, basically. So the question is this guy going to be good enough to shift Priest in that direction? And I think, realistically, maybe it is. Especially if they shift away from a full Galakron package, which seems pretty reasonable as well. So, yeah. Card is definitely good enough for Zoo, and probably good enough for some other decks as well. Next we have Flesh Giant, yet another Priest/Warlock card. 8 mana, 8/8, costs 1 less for each time your hero's health changed during your turns. So, a lot like the Vile Spine Slayer guy. You can either heal yourself or damage yourself as an activator for this. It of course has the same activators as that other card. I'm just not sure that this sort of Control Priest archetype is really that interested in a 0 mana 8/8. These cheap big threats tend to be good in decks with a lot of threats, so you can basically overwhelm your opponent's removal. And Priest typically doesn't do that. Like, yeah, this would be pretty strong if you curved it, like Shield of Galakron into Kronks, into Galakron plus 0 mana Flesh Giant. That's obviously like a pretty insane curve. But I think it's pretty unlikely that happens. And even with a bunch of activators, I think it usually takes a while to get this down to 0 mana. So a lot of times it's like, 3 mana 8/8. Which of course a 3 mana 8/8 is pretty strong. But when it's one of your only threats, it doesn't really matter that much that it's cheap, because they just remove it and, then you have to respond to whatever they're doing next turn. I just think this sort of card is not really what Priest is looking for necessarily. I do think it's quite a bit more interesting in Warlock though, because Warlock tends to be more threat dense. You can play this alongside like Abyssal Summoners, or Crazed Netherwing plus Flesh Giant is a pretty reasonable turn. Alex draws a double Flesh Giant is probably a turn you could have. In Quest Warlock in particular, I do think it's a bit sketchy, because it's not really a good thing to hit off the quest hero power, and they tend to have like more explosive murdery turns with like Malagos and Alexstrasza, rather than just than their whole gameplay just being threatened to threat like old Mountain Giant decks were. But I certainly think it's a reasonable card for a deck like this. And like I said, maybe Control Warlock isn't necessarily a quest deck. Maybe in like Galakron Warlock, this would be a more reasonable card. And also compared to Priest, I think you tend to use your hero power in Warlock more often than you do in Priest, so this probably gets cheaper quicker. I don't know if you can find the deck space for it, but certainly a fine card. I think maybe one of the most interesting potential applications of this card would be to see if Zoo can afford to play it. I talked about this a bit with the other thing. Zoo doesn't currently play that much self-damage stuff, but it's pretty easy to jam in, Flame Imp and Neferset Thrasher. You're using your hero power in Zoo somewhat often. You can even go for like Dark Glare plus Diseased Vulture stuff. I think if you can reliably get this down to like even a 4 mana 8/8, maybe Zoo would be interested in playing it. Once you start getting down to like 3 mana 8/8, I think this card starts to look pretty insane. And with all of the card draw out of Hand of Gul'dan, you can actually dig for Flesh Giant pretty reliably. So if you're playing, double Flame Imp, like you probably still want to be playing a lot of 1-drops with probably Scrap Imp and Magic Carpet. So if your 1-drops are just like Flame Imps, and at this point, like maybe Voodoo Doctor's not even a meme, if you're drawing into Flesh Giant so reliably, maybe this could actually be a way to take Zoo. I think that's pretty ambitious, but it would certainly be powerful. Next we have Cabal Acolyte, 4 mana 2/6 taunt, spell burst, gain control of a random enemy minion with 2 or less attack. So the obvious comparison for this card is Cabal Shadow Priest. And I think this is going to cost about as much mana as Cabal Shadow Priest much of the time. If we look at the priest spells that see play, like you're often playing this with, I don't know, Shadow or Death or Thought Steal or Penance or something to activate it. So it's still kind of a 6 mana play. But certainly getting a 2/6 taunt is better than getting a Chill Wind Yeti, in priest at least. And of course you get the effect of the spell you play as well. But that's not necessarily a good thing. It is a 2-card combo instead of a 1-card combo with the Cabal Shadow Priest. And if you're using like Penance, you do need to be able to kill something for 3 damage and have something else to take control of with 2 or less attack, which is not always going to happen. And similar to Shadow or Death, they're not always going to have a 5-power minion and a 2-power minion. So definitely a pretty situational card. You can just play this on turn 4 and hope it survives a turn. As a 2/6, that's probably pretty reasonable. But again, you still need to actually have something to take control of, and when you're just playing this and hoping it lives, they can kind of just trade off their 2/2s and only leave 3-power minions in play, and then the spell burst on this doesn't look that good. You can also play some of Priest's synergy cards, like Lazul's Scheme is pretty nasty with this. You could turn 4, take control of, what, a 5 or 6-power minion or something, if that's ever a thing, but it's, you know, how often is that going to come up? Probably not very often. There's also Scarlet Subjugator, but then that's becoming like a 3-card combo, which is pretty sketchy. And how much mana does it even cost at that point? So, I don't know. I mean, there's definitely a lot you can do with this card, but I think it's, like, it looks pretty situational, and I think it might even be more situational than it looks at a glance. And on top of that, I've mentioned it a lot with the priest cards, or I think I have, maybe I haven't. But like, it's pretty hard to make room for this kind of effect. I guess this you would probably just directly replace Shadow Madness with, but Shadow Madness hits a lot more targets with that extra stat point being available to it. So, I don't know, like this is a powerful effect, but I think it's a pretty sketchy card in general.